Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on blending digital analytics with human creativity to deliver the optimal customer experience. I'm Megan Winnery, Senior Demand Gen Manager at Telium, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar will last approximately 30 minutes and will be recorded, and the slides and the recording of the presentation will be made available at the end of the session. Please note that you'll find some related resources in the attachments and links section that you can view during or after the webinar. And we want to hear your questions, so please use the Q&A feature to submit them. And for any that we aren't able to answer live, we'll follow up with you after the webinar is over. And lastly, you'll see the social hashtag for today's webinar in the lower right-hand corner of our deck, hashtag TeliumCXWebinar. We encourage you to retweet, like, and share as we live tweet throughout the webinar. And now for today's presenter. Reed Bryant is the VP of Data Science at Blue Acorn ICI, where he is responsible for building a world-class team focused on creating and capturing value through the sophisticated application of data science to digital analytics, optimization, and personalization. He has 13 years of expertise in quantitative fields and has led high-performing analytics programs for clients like Microsoft, Barnes & Noble, Bank of America, Viacom, and more. Reed holds a master's in analytics from the Institute of Advanced Analytics at NC State and a bachelor's degree in business administration from UNC Chapel Hill. He is a co-founder of the Raleigh chapter of the Digital Analytics Association and provides annual marketing analytics lectures to Duke University and NC State. All right, Reed, over to you.
Thanks so much, Megan, for the warm introduction. And a huge shout out and thank you to Telium. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I really appreciate the voice that you give the larger digital analytics community. So let's jump right in. So I want to kick things off today and just with kind of a thought experiment. Just take a second and think about the very last time you started something new. That could be a new job, it could be a new analysis, a new problem your boss asked you to solve. Think about that for a second. Did you actually stop to, put some thought into that, or did you just pull something off the shelf and execute? And the reason I think this is important is the moment that you start something new is singular and unique, and it defines all the hours and all the work that comes after executing. The more important the task is, the more time we should spend thinking up front. And I think in digital analytics, this is key. It's all too easy to grab a pre-existing report from Google or Adobe and just run with it. But if you're using a pre-built report, it's not necessarily always the best match to the business question, especially if your bar is high, especially if your bar is trying to use data to drive an optimal customer experience. And this became really obvious to me when I was reading a blog, waitbutwhy.com, not too long ago. And they used a really profound, at least in my mind, cooking analogy that was defining the difference between cooks and chefs. So cooks ultimately are following a recipe. Some follow it verbatim. Some are a little bit more comfortable and add their own flair. But ultimately, they're following something that has been built by another person to solve another task. Chefs, all the way on the other end of the spectrum, are unique. They're almost like physicists. They take the problem, they boil it down to the smallest possible level, in their case, the raw ingredients, and then they layer on top their own experience and vision. And out pops something that is, ultimately crafted to that problem they're trying to solve or their vision for the scenario. It's my premise that digital analytics need more chefs out there. Pre-built reports are great, and sometimes they're useful when you need to get a quick win, but just because they're there doesn't mean you always have to use them. I think that's where the creative process really comes into play. So if we know and believe that creativity is important, the next question we should ask ourselves is, how do we get there? And one method that I'll put forward here in just a moment is lateral thinking. But before we get to this idea of lateral thinking, I want to kind of jump in our hot tub time machine, revisit 1995, the early days of Amazon. So envision kind of this bare warehouse, concrete floors, Jeff Bezos with a couple employees on the floor, rapidly packing, trying to keep up with demand. So at the end of a long day, Bezos makes the suggestion, hey, we need to buy knee pads. This is, the current state of affairs is less than ideal. He was kind of stuck in this mentality of, I need to get more boxes out given the fixed limitations that face me. And that's honestly how most people think. When most people play chess, they rightly assume they have certain pieces, and each piece has its own unique attributes and own unique limitation. More often than not, in real life, our chess pieces aren't quite as fixed as we would believe. And so lateral thinking, which I'll get into in a minute, is really the process of removing our preconceived notions of fixed mentality. So you can think about it in this way. Lawnmowers are commonly known to cut grass, but they also have a motor. So if you didn't need your gas cut and you needed a mode of transportation, perhaps a lawnmower could solve that. That's the idea of lateral thinking. So let's revisit this kind of the early days of Amazon back in '95. So luckily for Bezos and the future of Amazon, he had another employee there when he was kind of debating this knee pad thing. And the employee took a different approach. Instead of, assuming this fixed mentality, he asked the question of, what are the alternatives to fixing our business problem, which was essentially trying to get more boxes packed and shipped in a shorter amount of time. And so when you take the step back to that level, the answer becomes more clear. If packing on the floor isn't a given, if that chess piece is not fixed, the answer is something very simplistic like what he put forward, which was like, hey, Jeff, let's buy some packing tables. We don't waste so much time bending over. We get more stuff done. So ultimately, creativity and that thought process of lateral thinking led to the better solution. All right, so you might be thinking, Reed, that's great, but how does that apply to digital analytics? And I think it's quite clear. So I was on a client trip just last Thursday and Friday, and one big question that the client had was, I have a website and I have a brick and mortar location. How can I understand the impact of my .com site to my in-store sales under this kind of unified commerce mentality? And so she viewed a possible solution as an attribution model. And that's not necessarily an incorrect assumption. An attribution model is commonly what one would use to solve that type of problem. But there were a couple of limitations at play. So up front, there was an acknowledgement that the data wasn't as good as it could be. So in order for the attribution model to function properly, the business would have to go through a process of, evaluating the implementation, involving strategy sessions, business requirements, solution designs, involving developers to re-implement what's necessary, allowing some data to aggregate and collect, and then invoking either a tool or a data scientist to understand and debate attribution models. So at that point, you're discussing first touch, last touch, linear attribution, etc. So months later, you're not really that much closer to answering the original question, which was less specifically about attribution models, but more about the ability to gauge the impact of the digital channel for in-store purchases. So an alternative way to think about solving this business problem is to take more of that chef approach, to look at more of a lateral thinking exercise. And so to do that, let's boil down the situation to the individual ingredients that exist. So that particular client had a ton of retail locations as fact number one. Fact number two is they have a direct mail team. That direct mail team has a ton of demographic research around test and control zip codes that are similar to one another. And that direct mail team has done historically a ton of testing, sending coupons to some zip codes and not others to just gauge the performance of that direct mail campaign. And then fact number three is the digital team has a couple pieces of technology at their disposal. First and foremost in this scenario is the optimization tool. That optimization tool would let them perform simple A/B tests. So if you take the business problem at hand, the three ingredients that I mentioned, one could come up with an alternative method that would look something like this. So we have kind of a three-step process laid out here. One, you borrow some research from that direct mail team to understand what markets, what zip codes are demographically similar to one another to establish a test and control market. And then you might do something radical as the second step, is remove the store locator button from the test markets and ultimately measure the impact after sufficient time has run according to the design of experiments criteria. And so that recipe, it may answer the question directly. It may be negatively viewed by the business. It may be viewed as too risky to revenue or something like that. But certainly it's an example of how lateral thinking can really take a complex business scenario and widen the choices at our disposal, really to better answer the business question at hand. So we've spent some time here. We kind of jumped right in, at a couple of different levels of altitude, trying to describe examples of the role human creativity plays with analytics and how it can drive ultimately a desirable customer experience. But let's take a second and zoom out and get a little bit more prescriptive around the building blocks of certain things that contribute to the ultimate success of a digital analytics program. And not just a standard digital analytics program, but one that is designed to provide the ultimate and a data-driven customer experience. So to do that, I've taken this traditional people, process, platform, the 3 Ps. I've taken that model and I've tried to customize it some. So at the very most simplistic level, to really impact the customer experience and have data that drives that experience at scale, an organization needs 3 basic things. So first and foremost is leadership. That very closely aligns to that first P, people. An organization also needs data quality, and that can largely speak to the processes that enable data to be activated. And lastly, at the top of that pyramid is activation itself. And activation is really a technology play, so that closely aligns with the platform component of the 3 Ps. All 3 of these combine to really be able to provide an analytics team the way to impact customer experience. So let's dive into these really briefly separately. We'll start with leadership. So it's been said time and time again that any kind of program, digital analytics or otherwise, any type of investment can die on the vine without proper executive support. So the executive team, the leadership team should be a group that establishes the vision for what the program will mean to the organization. They assign ownership. So in this case, who owns the implementation of digital analytics? Who owns using that tool? Is it marketing? Is it IT? Is it shared? Is it an analytics COE? Ultimately, without clear ownership, proper maintenance falls to the wayside, and true subject matter expertise can exist on top of data that is not properly maintained. So moving on, permission to fail. I think this is really kind of thought-provoking from a leadership perspective. A coworker mentioned to me this idea of making new mistakes. I thought that was actually quite profound because it means 2 things. I'm not sure if she meant this or not, but I took 2 things away from this making new mistakes. One, it means that you're pushing hard enough to get outside your comfort zone where you're in the position to make a mistake, but you're also in the position of doing something extraordinary. And secondly, it means that you're not making the same mistakes. Making new mistakes implies that you're learning from things that you've done in the past and you're not repeating those same mistakes, quickly iterating and growing. And lastly, from a leadership perspective, it's this idea of sparking joy. So I'm sure everyone's seen the Marie Kondo television. She's kind of like the anti-hoarder. She's famous for asking ridiculous questions like, looking at a pair of socks and saying, does this spark joy or not? And, although that may be a little bit over the top from an analytics perspective or point of view, I do think that leaders in analytics absolutely have a requirement to spark joy and display passion. Without passion from the very top, there's no possible way that people working with you and collaborating with you will be able to generate creative solutions. Creative solutions require passion from the top. So moving on, item number 2 is data quality. I'm sure everyone has heard this idea of garbage in, garbage out from a data perspective, but I think it's taken a much bigger meaning over the last couple of years. More than likely, everyone is familiar with this garbage in, garbage out from the perspective of an analyst trying to comb through data and extract insights. If you don't have quality data, your insights will be meaningless. And that's kind of, almost taken for granted these days, but it certainly exists. The second component is what's interesting going forward. So with the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence, that's ultimately an algorithm. An algorithm is only as effective as the data that is at the disposal of that algorithm. And even the most advanced algorithms will underperform if that model is not supplied with correct and accurate information, if that model doesn't have that data quality. So one quick talking point here, this really kind of illustrates the point, is I was helping run a series of tests for a retailer where they were taking their old, antiquated, in-house product rec engine, and they were comparing that in a proof of concept against 3 separate vendors in the product rec space. Every one of those vendors loaded with private equity investment, loaded with data scientists, trying to make the very most robust algorithms available to outperform things like this, the in-house engines that companies have developed over time. And so as that test ran and concluded, we looked at the results and, to our surprise, the old in-house engine really outperformed all 3 leading vendors. And so when we started digging in, trying to ask the question of how this happened, one thing became acutely clear that we didn't know before, and that old in-house product rec engine had access to in-store purchase data from authenticated customers, from that loyal customer base. And that was the differentiator. Even though the algorithm itself was far less advanced than the 3 vendors, that algorithm had access to data. And in that particular scenario, as I would expect, quality data led to a better outcome, even with a worse or an inferior algorithm. And third, but not least, is activation. So data drives value through activation in a couple ways. First, and maybe most importantly, it changes consumer outcomes. And second, it should supply the organization with insights on their customers. So if you look at how activation happens, there are a couple of things going on. So you're collecting data, sometimes first-party data in an analytics tool, sometimes third-party data in a data management platform. All of that is, if you have the correct tools and technology at your disposal, stitched together by a common ID in a CDP or customer data platform. And that platform is important because it houses the data and then it allows other platforms to use that for activation. And that's kind of that true activation layer. And, different people mean different things with that. I think about it in terms of testing and personalization tools and things like ESPs, things that are designed to targeted experience to the right person at the right time and do so in a measurable way. And then the second way that data provides activation is the actual insights and supplying that insight to the rest of the organization. And from a tech stack, that's your typical BI, business intelligence tool that lets an analyst or a data scientist, or in some cases even marketers, take data out of an analytics tool and visualize it in a way that drives change. And the last point I want to make is kind of centered around that. More often than not, digital analytics programs are newer than their traditional analytics counterparts. And so oftentimes I see them playing a subservient role to a larger, more established customer insight team. And it's my belief that for an organization to be truly customer-centric and drive customer experience at scale, the digital analytics team actually needs to not only ingest information from a customer insight team, but moreover, they need to supply insights to a customer insight team and the rest of the organization. The digital channel and therein digital analytics, they're the best part of the organization positioned to truly understand customer need, things like customer pathing, and even answering questions around product assortment. So if you're in the digital analytics space, use this to your advantage and be a resource and be part of the team that can really drive organizational change. So to wrap things up, I wanted to provide a success recipe I'm sorry for the food pun. Actually, sorry, not sorry for the food pun. It's just too good to pass up. Yeah, I guess in conclusion, I think that, oftentimes consultants will go in to help a business. They'll answer questions like, what business are you really in? They'll ask questions like, is McDonald's actually in the restaurant business, or are they kind of actually in the real estate business? And I think as part of the digital analytics community, we need to be asking the same exact questions of ourselves and our role. What are we in the business of? And the answer to that will mean something a little bit different to each of us. But that said, there are certain commonalities to success, and we've talked through some of those today. What a program needs to be successful is a combination of leadership, it's a combination of data quality, and it's a combination of the ability to activate on that data quality, to activate on that clean data. But our goal is to provide the optimal customer experience. That was in the title. It's not to provide an acceptable customer experience. That's where the creativity part comes in. I think creativity can certainly make the difference between being a company that provides an acceptable customer experience and being a company that provides an optimal customer experience. And so with that, I'll wrap up and I'll toss it back to Megan to see if any questions have queued up.
Thanks, Reed. Before we get started on the Q&A, I wanted to point out that we have Reed's Industry Expert Series report that takes a deeper dive into what he's covered today, and you can check that out in the attachments and links section. And then we also have more resources on telium.com and blueacornici.com, so check them out. All right, ready for Q&A. If you have any questions, please use the Ask a Question feature, and we'll start answering them right now. All right, first question, Reed. You mentioned that data quality is crucial in building an impactful digital analytics program. Are there any specific solutions you'd recommend that ensure continuous data quality?
Okay, yeah, so that's a great question. A couple different ways that I could go there. But I think that, like anything else, it's a combination of platforms, or more specifically technology, and the correct process to ensure that data quality and ensure that data quality from a continuous perspective. So, if you look at data sources, you have analytics tools, you have DMPs, you have CDPs, and they're all important from a collection perspective. The CDP is actually interesting from a visitor stitching perspective. In grad school, I remember laboring over a bunch of code, trying to figure out, how to do appropriate visitor stitching to get that unique customer profile, and going through a bunch of deduplication efforts, et cetera, inner outer joins. The nice thing with CDP is that it does that for you, which is nice. Anything where you can leverage technology to remove human error will certainly ensure continuous data quality. So I think that's important. Also, more on the back end, there are pieces of technology available that can provide and help with automatic data scans. And I guess, and lastly, outside of kind of what the tools can do for you, you as an organization need to think about the investment that you're making from a technology perspective and matching that investment at the appropriate level from a personnel perspective, whether that's an internal resource you hire or an external partner you engage with. The technology will get you part of the way, but extracting the value from that technology is really done through an investment in human capital.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. Can you expand on what data drives value through activation means and how it's done? And why is it important to activate my data?
Yeah, okay. So activation, and I kind of hinted on this a little bit in the activation section, but activation can certainly mean different things to different people in different groups, depending upon where you are in the business. I personally tend to think about activation, from a generalized perspective with, tools and technology that can drive experiences that change customer outcomes. And so if you think about it from that perspective, things like testing or targeting or personalization tools can change the outcome of a site experience based on an attribute that you know about, one of your users or one of your customers. And then I think the other method is, the retargeting effort, and that's the cross-channel orchestration, either in an email ESP that will, send retargeting emails or text, in-app messages, what have you, to a user to also ultimately change that outcome. And really the idea of activation is, and why it's critical, is that, you're doing a heck of a lot of work and you're making a lot of investment setting up your analytics solutions, ensuring that the appropriate documentation is there, making sure that it is properly maintained and updated. And that data in and of itself really has next to no value unless it can be used to impact the customer experience. And I think that's where the activation component comes in. And the last thing that I'll mention on activation is, I think doing it the proper way is incredibly important. And I think the proper way to evaluate any kind of activation effort is from a measurable standpoint. So typically from a causal perspective, either A/B or MVT testing or even email with the holdout group allows you to establish, the performance of that campaign over another campaign or over a control. And it's really the ability to measure the effectiveness of your activation efforts. That quantitative approach helps you understand, is that activation successful? Is it a failure? Is it driving that positive ROI? If so, great. How can I do more of it? And if it's not, what have I learned? How can I iterate from there? And what can I do to kind of understand the customers and change the outcome next time around?
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Reed. That's all the time that we have for today. If we weren't able to answer your questions, we will follow up with you after the webinar is over. And thank you, Reed, for sharing your expertise with us, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Have a great day, everyone.